Everybody, good morning. I know that I've not got all your handouts because I was doing this little last minute addition to the notes here today. The handouts are up here. Who doesn't have one that would like one? You find them useful. Okay, there's two hands. There you are. There you go. Huh?
Do I get to keep the clipboard?
We're not going to miss it if it walks away. There you go. Oh, man. There you go. All right.
I'm on grade yours now.
Yeah, Mike, you're going to, as you fill that out, that's going to be my entry key for me, so make sure you fill that out. All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our 10th session on the book of Job, a class about a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Seems like I had some little housekeeping thing to make mention of today, but I can't think of it at the moment. So if I do think of it, we'll talk about it. If I don't, we won't. Simple as that. So this week, we get to be just a little different. As you'll recall from weeks prior, we have spent lots and lots of time looking at how terrible Job's friends are relative to how righteous Job is, and kind of watching that sort of, just how it kind of started off bad but just got worse. At the very beginning of the book of Job, Job is lamenting all of his suffering, and rightly so, because he went through an immense amount of it that's brought to him by the Satan. So from there, Job's friends would one way back and forth say, hey, you are guilty of all this wickedness. And Job, by this point in chapter 27, where we're beginning today, by this point, he has had enough. Job has clearly had enough because, well, frankly, the accusations brought against him are not fair, like especially Eliphaz back in chapter 22. If you'll recall, he goes through and says, is not your wickedness great? For you have taken pledges of your brothers without cause, stripped men naked, to the weary you've given no water to drink. Somewhere in there you've taken the strength away from the orphans. There it is, verse 9. You have sent widows away empty, and the strength of the orphans has been crushed. Of course, by you is what he is suggesting there. Something that's going to really be reiterated or readdressed here in our discussion today is what Job has done with the people around him, and how that has been, how those accusations against him truly are false. But that doesn't mean that Job is ultimately sinless in all of this. So let's begin there in chapter 27. We'll start by reading the first 6 verses. Then Job continued his discourse and said, as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has embittered my soul, for as long as life is in me, and the breath of God is in my nostrils, my lips certainly will not speak unjustly, nor will my tongue mutter deceit. Far be it from me that I should declare you right, referring to his friends there. It's a plural you. Second part of verse 5, till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I will hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach any of my days. All right. So one of the first observations, real quick, to know that we're kind of in a separate section of the text here, is how verse 1 begins. Notice, then Job continued his discourse and said. If you look at just about every single one of the other speeches that we've seen so far, back in chapter 26, then Job responded. Back in 25, then Bildad the Shuhite answered, which is the same word, I think, in the Hebrew. If you go back to 23, then Job replied. Then Eliphaz the Temanite responded. Then Job answered. Back in 21, and that pattern is consistent through just about every chapter preceding this one. Things are different now because he is beginning a true speech here, leading into the second half of the book, even though we're more than halfway through just by number of chapters. Where Job really begins here is starting there again in verse 2. Look at the attitude he is speaking against God there. What is he convicting God of doing there in the first couple verses, 2 and 3? I guess it's really mostly 2. As God lives, who has taken away my right. God is guilty of taking away his right. And the Almighty, who has embittered my soul. This is kind of reminiscent of Pharaoh during the exodus of the Israelites back in Exodus. How shall I say this? Job's heart, which is embittered at this point, God is not actively going in and making his heart bitter, right? Because that would mean he's taking away some level of Job's choice. I think Job knows that. I don't think he's saying that. And I don't think Pharaoh, when he says, let God harden my heart, and anybody who says that in the Bible, I don't think any of them are saying that God is taking away their free will, so to speak. Job is saying God is guilty of these things. Which is also kind of interesting when you see that there in verse 3, and the breath of God is in my nostrils. He still acknowledges God's ability to give life. So he's not trying to, demote God's power in any way. What he is saying is God, for all of his power, is being unjust. And how do we know he is saying God at this point is unjust? Verse 4, my lips will certainly not speak unjustly. Job, while a blameless and upright man who feared God and turned away from evil, was not sinless. He is convicting God of being unjust. And if God is unjust, that means he is capable of sin. God is not. God is devoid of sin. You think of, I think it's Titus chapter 1, verse 2. It says, God cannot lie. It's not the greatest translation there in the Greek. It's not so much that God cannot lie, as that God is devoid. He is without lying. God is without sin. And because Job has guilted him of that, or at least tried to convict him of that, he is putting his own righteousness above God's. No good. And we'll see what God thinks of that in later chapters.
And that's what you get out of the first 4 verses.
That's out of the first 4 verses. You have a different thought there?
Well, I don't interpret it that way at all. The way I read it, he's saying, as God liveth, who taketh away my judgment, and Almighty, all the while the breath is in me, in the Spirit of God is in my lips, will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue any other deceit. He says later on in the book, God takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. So I thought he was referring to the men that came to him and told him he was wicked and evil and he deserved all this. And he's saying, while God allowed it, I'm talking to you, I'm not talking to God.
Well, at this point, he has kind of shifted his focus away from the, other than there in verse 5, far be it from me that I should declare you right. He is still kind of referring to his friends here. He's going to start shifting away. The language there, and maybe this is a matter of, maybe it's our versions are just different enough that there's something being miscommunicated there, but he's guilting God. He's saying God has taken away his right and embittered his soul. And that's not something God did. Right? There was no right God took away. Can you read your verse 2 there? Because I know you read the King James.
God liveth, who hath taken away my judgment, and the Almighty, who hath vexed my soul.
I don't know that it's right of Job to say that God vexed his soul.
Well, Satan did all that, but God allowed it.
Right, but just because God allows something doesn't mean he approves of it. That's kind of...
And he didn't approve of that.
Say again.
He allowed divorce, but he didn't approve of it.
Right, exactly. So, I don't know, are there other thoughts on that in the room?
Well, I kind of had a similar thought to Brother Mike. I have the King James Version as well. That may be one of the differences. But I wondered if that was, albeit maybe a clumsy way, Job saying basically God is in charge, in control of everything.
Sure.
So I'm vexed right now. I don't know what I've done wrong. God is in charge of that. But I'm not going to speak wickedness or whatever.
The New American Standard reads embittered, and I think, does anybody have an NIV with them? It says something similar to that. So that could be a big source of the confusion here.
Well, Young's literal translation reads that God made my soul bitter. He said God did it.
Well, then,
He doesn't say God allowed it. He's saying, kind of in line with what you were saying, he's directly blaming God for, he's saying, I'm bitter and it's God's fault.
yeah.
Whatever the truth is, there's a very ancient Jewish, if you read Jewish literature, the Jewish literature says that what God allows, God does. Okay, so that's the rabbinic idea. You see, he's in control of everything. So, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's what they believe. So, and I think that's what Job believes too. I don't think that's, I mean, it has a kernel of truth to it, right?
Sure, right.
He's the creator. And so they get it from that. So what God allows, God does. That's the short of what they believe. And I think that's what I think Job is in that loop in his head.
Sure. Well, that sounds related to me. To me, it sounds related to the idea of, that law of retribution. If God allows something, then He does it. And I do think at this point it's been pretty clear that Job, especially as we go later on into chapters 29 and 30, it's going to be clear that Job has some sense of that. So I don't know that this right here has been a clearly powerful example of making sure that we look at multiple translations and see what is closer, and looks like we need to look a little closer at the Hebrew there. I'll do that, and I'll have a thought for that next week.
Well, Trevor, God allows us to sin. He allows us to make a choice.
Right.
And so, did God.
Again, I didn't
say
say that.
that's
I didn't say
right.
that was the way it really is.
Right.
It's the way
Okay.
that's the
Right.
philosophy they have. That's the understanding. So,
Even as you got into Jesus' time.
now way on that, including, in fact, many believe that today.
True enough.
Dig very deep, you'll find out that's what they believe.
Well, nevertheless, as Job is having this conversation, or leading this conversation at the point, he is holding, look there in verse 6 again, I hold fast to my righteousness, and I'll not let it go. He does not believe himself to have been worthy of all of the suffering that he endured, which is where all of his problems were at. And as we know from the very onset, it was never about him deserving all of the things. We also know that we never get a full answer about why they really did happen to him. We just understand what the relationship between man and God ought to be during those times. Job begins to reiterate himself starting in verse 7 all the way down through the end of the chapter. May my enemy be as the wicked and my opponent as the unjust. Clearly suggesting that he is not wicked or unjust. And I would largely agree with that. For what is the hope of the godless when he is cut off? When God requires his life? Will God hear his cry when distress comes upon him? Will he take delight in the Almighty? Will he call on God at all times? I will instruct you in the power of God. What is with the Almighty I will not conceal. Behold, all of you have seen it. Why then do you act foolishly? It seems like Job is kind of calling back to, I think it's chapter 19, where he says, hey, have you not heard of the things that happened in the world around us, about all of these wicked things that do happen? Verse 13, this is the portion of a wicked man from God, and the inheritance which tyrants receive from the Almighty. Though his sons are many, they are destined for the sword, and his descendants will not be satisfied with bread. His survivors will be buried because of the plague, and their widows will not be able to weep. Though he piles up silver like dust and prepares garments as plentiful as the clay, he may prepare it, but the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. He built his house like a spider's web, or as a hut which the watchman has made. He lies down rich, but never again. He opens his eyes, and it is no longer. Terror overtakes him like a flood. A tempest steals him away in the night. The east wind carries him away, and he is gone, for it whirls him away from his place. For it will hurl at him without sparing. He will surely try to flee from his power. Men will clap their hands at him and will hiss at him from his place. All of this right here demonstrates that while Job doesn't have a full understanding of justice and what right and wrong is, and the full expression of wisdom, as we'll look at a little more closely here in chapter 28, it is clear that he understands that God does deliver the wicked what they are due ultimately. The reality is, for the wicked man, he might die happily. Job talked about that earlier on. He may die happily. And we know of many, many evil people who go to their grave under the impression they've lived a pretty full life and they're going to be happy with what's going to happen on the other side. Obviously, things aren't good for them on the other side, but what kind of legacy did they leave for their children? I mean, I think of in an earlier, let's just think in terms of the English kings and monarchies. Like, there were some rough things that happened to the descendants of all those people because of the wickedness. I mean, you see loyalty. I mean, people love David. Think back to David. People were loyal to him, and thus they were loyal to Solomon. And eventually, I would argue that Solomon is one of the biggest reasons why Israel ultimately fell away and got delivered into the hands of various oppressors, whatever the case is. Wickedness does receive its just reward and event, and even if that doesn't happen in this life, it ultimately does happen. Again, back in, I think it's chapter 21, again, verse 30, the wicked is reserved for the day of calamity. Job understands something. He doesn't understand the full expression of it, but he gets something. All right. You might remember from, any thoughts on that before we move on to chapter 28? Chapter 28 is pretty big here in the book of Job. Right.
And disappointments and things that we're wrong, and we have emotions that range from anger and bitterness and everything else. But despite those emotions, we have to come out on the other side and say, God's in control. God knows best. We will not curse you because of the way I feel.
Oh, yeah. And I'm not trying to make Job out to be this blatantly terrible guy who is ignorant of the Lord at this point. Because I think you're right. At least in some ways, he does acknowledge his emotion. But as we'll see as we go through chapter 28, he'll talk about wisdom in the only place it can truly be found. And he talks about that being with God. This entire time, he's wanted to hear from God. I don't know if he has ever actually literally heard from him before what he was thinking of as he was desiring those things. But especially as we go through chapter 31, we probably won't make it up to that chapter and through it, but there are so many claims that Job makes about, if I have done these bad things, let me receive my reward for that. And he's talking to God about that. He's trying to appeal to the justice of God. So I think you're right. He does ultimately trust God, even if he misspeaks at times. Did that get to at all the point of what you're saying? All right. Any other thoughts before we move on to chapter 28 here? You might remember from the very first session, unless you weren't here during the first session, then you won't remember this, mentioned this term chiasm. And I've used it just once or twice since that very first time to kind of reiterate this thought. A chiasm is a form of poetry that is kind of in mirrors. The last part of the poem and the first part reflect each other, and the next part reflects the second to last part, and so forth, leading to a central theme, which is ultimately the main point of the poem. I should write a poem like that sometime for if I ever teach this class again. That way it illustrates it. We do see that prevalently in Hebrew poetry. If you go through the book of Psalms and you really look for those sorts of themes, I'm not saying you should go forth and look for chiasms because, who does that? But it will help us to better understand these things. Chapter 28 roughly falls into the center. Okay, so let me illustrate this real quick. Roughly how this looks. So the very beginning of the book of Job, we have chapters 1 and 2, which talk about Job's suffering. It's a narrative style. And these narrative bookends really help establish this point. I should probably move this. Not all of you are going to be able to see it very well anyway, but hopefully a little bit of help there. So, this is consistent with the last chapter, and really the last section of the last chapter, 42, verses 7 through 17, are another narrative where Job receives blessing. Spoiler alert, Job's life turns around pretty well. This is more of a narrative. Again, I know you can't all see that. If you really want to see it later, I'll make sure that I don't erase it until next week. After those events, you get the immediate response of Job. Job, in the first section, in chapter 3, he's responding to his suffering. So Job is responding to something not one of his friends, right? He's not responding to a person, he is responding to something distinct. In the later portion of the book, chapter 42, verses 1 through 6, Job responds instead to God. Between those, bear with me, we're getting to where this is coming to a point here. You have 3 rounds of speeches. Went out of order there. Bear with me, I put the chapters here at the end of the line instead of at the beginning. So there are 3 rounds of speeches. You maybe even could say 26 there. And then there are 3 great speeches. And remember, or perhaps I should say, realize that for the Hebrews, the numbers game means a lot. So even though there are 3 rounds of speeches, which adds up to several, the significance of the number 3 would mean a lot to them, rather than the actual amount of speeches that happened there. And then this is going to be 29 through 41. All leading up to this point, chapter 28, a poem of wisdom. Now, why is this just some useless exercise? You know, maybe there's a whole point to what the central idea is. Do we get all that? Sure. But I think if we really go through and think about how this could apply, or look at the content here and how this really applies, I think it'll be more clear. The beginning of chapter 28 talks about man and his pursuit of stuff and how we can find it. And that makes sense to Job. Let's read those first 11 verses real quick. Surely there is a mine for silver, in a place where they refine gold. Iron is taken from the dust, and copper is smelted from rock or ore. Man puts an end to darkness, and to the farthest limit he searches out. The rock in gloom and deep shadow. Again, that could be ore, depending on the translation there. Good translation. He sinks a shaft far from habitation, forgotten by the foot. They hang and swing to and fro far from men. The earth, from it comes food, and underneath it is turned up as fire. Its rocks, or its ore, are the source of sapphires, and its dust contains gold. The path no bird of prey knows, nor has the falcon's eye caught sight of it. The proud beasts have not trodden it, nor has the fierce lion passed over it. He, again referring to man, he puts his hand on the flint. He overturns the mountains at the base. He hews out channels through the rocks, and his eye sees anything precious. He dams up the streams from flowing, and what is hidden he brings out to the light. Maybe at first glance that might sound a little bit like God. He's speaking about God there, particularly there in verse 10, how he hews out channels from the rocks. But he's really talking about how people search for things, talking about the search for something. And people can find rock and iron and copper and gems and all of these precious things. And animals often can't. Now, maybe with some special training, you can get some animals to seek out certain things, certain materials in the earth, but most animals aren't going to actively search for, say, oil on their own. There's no real benefit they have to that. So clearly man is capable of finding some things and understanding some things, and we see that theme throughout the earlier portion of the book of Job, and I would even argue later chapters when Elihu even speaks up. We'll talk more about him next week. But starting there in verse 12, it's clear that man doesn't understand everything and can't understand everything, at least not of its own value. Verse 12, but where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. The deep says, it's not in me, and the sea says, it's not with me. Pure gold cannot be given in exchange for it, nor can silver be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir and precious onyx or sapphire. Gold or glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for articles of fine gold. Coral and crystal are not mentioned, but in the acquisition of wisdom is above that of pearls. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. So right there, chapter 28, verses 12 through 19, after he just got done talking about man's capacity to find all of these great and precious things, what good is that in the pursuit of wisdom? Can you pursue wisdom like you pursue this other stuff? No, you cannot. He even elaborates later on, or as you go on there in verse 20 up through 22. Where then does wisdom come from, and where is the place of understanding? Thus it is hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the sky. I find it very interesting there that not only is he talking about how mankind can't find it, but of course neither can wildlife in any way, which is kind of interesting. If you look through the Proverbs, Solomon will frequently refer to the wisdom of various small creatures. Clearly a different kind of wisdom than Job is talking about here. Verse 22, Abaddon and death say, with our ears we have heard a report of it. This is death and destruction he's referring to there in verse 22. These are, I'll be honest, I'm not fully aware of the nature of the Hebrew mindset regarding Abaddon and death. Do they think it's a spiritual thing? Do they think it's removed from the physical and spiritual? I'm not particularly sure of that, though I do find it interesting that this Abaddon and death have heard a report of it when everything else up to that point is clueless. So there's maybe something a little bit there. Maybe serves as a transition statement to the main drive of chapter 28. God understands its, referring to wisdom, God understands its way, and he knows its place. For he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he imparted weight to the wind and meted out the waters by measure, when he set a limit for the rain and a course for the thunderbolt, then he saw it and declared it. He established it and also searched it out. And to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. This is why the whole chapter 28, this is why I think all of this actually has some significance. Because as Job is desperately seeking to understand, and at times has spoken out of turn towards the Lord, he is not sinless in this. Again, sinlessness and blamelessness, all of that up there, not the same thing. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But there are people who are ultimately saved, as we know. If you're found blameless, that doesn't mean you are ultimately sinless. Man tries to understand things. We see that here in chapter 28, all the way down through verse 22, really. 1 through 22. Man searches for things, and they're capable of searching for things. But they can't get a full bead on what ultimately God can do. And if you watch through the course of our study of Job, it is clear that that is the whole nature of all of it. Because ultimately, God does not answer Job why these things happen to him. We'll see starting in chapter 38, God talks about his greatness. And so fearing him, even when we don't understand things, we can obtain wisdom in that. So I think the whole point of the book of Job really is boiled down to this notion of where do we seek wisdom from, no matter the circumstance that shows up in our lives. And it can be hard. Job has illustrated that for us. Job didn't get it right the whole time through. But he does ultimately understand that God fully is in control. We spent a lot of time talking about, this nature and why this really is the main drive. What are some thoughts on that? Any additional things to say there?
You can find anything in the earth if you've got the technique to do it. You can dig for all these. In fact, the four metals is kind of interesting. That's the most precious metals to ancient man. But so you do all that, but wisdom. He's not talking practical wisdom.
Right.
I can sort of help my son get some practical wisdom, but this wisdom is godly wisdom that you only can get if God shares some of it with you. Example.
Right.
Here's an example. I think Matthew 16. Remember Jesus asked, "Who am I?" Basically, okay.
Oh, sure.
Okay. And Peter says, "You're who? You're the Christ, Son of God." What did Jesus say back? You didn't figure that out on your own. He says,
God gave you understanding.
That's godly wisdom. Practically, he couldn't have figured that out. That's the way it works.
Right.
There's practical wisdom, and that's obtainable by people, but real godly wisdom, the way the universe works, why God does what he does, man.
We cannot know those things without his wisdom, absolutely. If you look in the book of James, the word wisdom there, I think comparing chapter 28 in the book of James would be an interesting study. In fact, if anybody picks up a handout here, I think one of the homework questions, 2 of them pertain to that study. The book of James only refers to the word wisdom 5 times. It only mentions that word 5 times, but it's so interesting just the kind of pull it presents, talking about perseverance at the onset. The first time it shows up is talking about wisdom's relationship with persevering through trials and tribulations. It sounds pretty familiar to what we've been studying through here. So I recommend checking that out. I think that could be the source of a rich study of wisdom for you. If you get the chance. Other thoughts on chapter 28? The pursuit of God's wisdom. All right, we'll kind of zip through here in the last few minutes. We've got chapters 29 through 31 to get to. At this point, we get some reflection on the things that has happened to Job and what sorts of things he lost that we didn't really see a crystal clear picture of there at the beginning, there in that narrative. So we'll start there in verse 1 of chapter 29. And Job again took up his discourse and said, there's that phrase again, emphasizing that this great speech of Job is really continuing. It's down here. Oh, that I were as in months gone by, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone over my head, and by his light I walked through darkness. Not in darkness, through darkness. As I was in the prime of my days, when the friendship of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me and my children were around me. Let's pause there real quick. When the Almighty was yet with me. At this point, does Job feel like God is with him? He used to be.
His friendship, his protection is just non-existent now.
Right. That is the perception that Job has at this point. I think the language there is very clear. At the very least, he feels that way. But look there in verse 4. I love that. As I was in the prime of my days. And what defines the prime of his days? Even though he's under the impression that God is not with him anymore, which ultimately we know is not really the case, he still feels that the prime of his days was defined by what? There in verse 4. Not just his blessings, but his relationship with who provides the blessings. when friendship of God was over my tent, as I was in the prime of my days. Even in all of this frustration and misery that he is enduring, he still knows that God's greatness is what refers to his prime. Life does not get better than when God is on your side. Kind of hard to argue with that. Now, he doesn't feel like God's on his side anymore, but that's not been the case since the very onset.
Verse 2 says it, and he's feeling it. He says,
Oh, yeah.
Lord, as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me. Ergo, God's not watching over him now.
Right.
And that's sad.
It is. And he longs for the days where it felt like God was watching over him. That's a powerful section of text right there. Just as a fun little aside, the Hebrew there, the prime of my days, literally refers to the harvest. You know, when harvest is bountiful. So when you're reaping that which you've sown and preparing for, they also translate it the days of my autumn. So that's after the growing season there in the summer. So Hebrews were under the impression that fall is objectively the best season. So do what you will with that for all you summer lovers out there. Let's pick up again in verse 5 and kind of work through here. When the Almighty was yet with me and my children were around me, he's lamenting the loss of his children there. Gut-wrenching. When my steps were bathed in butter and the rock poured out for me streams of oil, great wealth that he had. When I went out to the gate of the city, when I took my seat in the square, look at the relationship he has with his community here. When I went out to the gate of the city, when I took the seat in the square, the young men saw me and hid themselves, or got themselves out of the way, really is more literal translation there. And the old men arose and stood. The princes stopped talking and put their hands on their mouths. The voice of the nobles was hushed, and their tongues stuck to their palate. For when the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw, it gave witness of me. I mean, look at the relationship he had with his community there. Job was not just some guy. He was the guy. Because I delivered the poor, look at this. For when the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw, it gave witness of me. Because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the one ready to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. I broke the jaws of the wicked and snatched the prey from his teeth. Then I thought, I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days as the sand. My root is spread out to the waters, and dew lies all night on my branch. My glory is ever new with me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. To me they listened and waited and kept silent for my counsel. All that stuff that he just talked about there. Because the poor that he delivered, all the way down through him talking about breaking the jaws of the wicked and so forth. The reason people revered him were because he did all of these great things. We could see that because of the book-ended thoughts here. To me they listened and waited and kept silent for my counsel. After my words, they did not speak again. Nobody needed the last word after Job spoke, and my speech dropped on them. They waited for me as for the rain, and opened their mouths as for the spring rain. I smiled on them when they did not believe, and the light of my face they did not cast down. I chose a way for them and sat as chief, and dwelt as king among the troops, as one who comforted the mourners. A great ruler is one who comforts the mourners. Can't help but think of Jesus and the kind of life that he gave, that servant king. Well, a lot of Christ-like imagery here. Job looks back to these things that were so great before, but he's lost them at this point. Obviously, we know that. Look where his life has taken him. But now those younger than I mock me, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock. I mean, just look through all of this here. We'll zip through verse 5. They, referring to the men that he disdained, they are driven from the community. They shout against them as a thief, so that they dwell in dreadful valleys. Verse 8, fools, even those without a name, they were scourged from the land. Verse 9, now I have become their taunt. I have even become a byword to them. And he just goes on throughout the rest of chapter 30, talking about the terrible things, the terrible relationship now that he has with that community that once revered him so. And then all of chapter 31, Job talks about how despite all of this, he has not lost his integrity, and he makes all of these assertions. He says, if I have done this, go through the text here in chapter 31. Look for the if statements followed up by you won't see the word then very often in the text. For instance, in chapter 31, verse 9, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or I have lurked at my neighbor's doorway, then, verse 10, may my wife grind for another and let others kneel down over her. And then he even gives a because. So if, then, and because statements. Look for those in your own study of chapter 31 to see really where Job feels righteousness should dwell. And with that, we're really burning up more time. Made our way through it. We didn't quite get through 31, but that's okay. That's how it goes. Elihu speaks next. This is Job's final big speech. So for next week, read chapters 32 through 37. I didn't update that on the handouts there. Sorry about that. And with that, thank you guys very much for your attention and your discussion this morning. If you need a handout and didn't get one, let me know and I will hook you up with that. Thank you all.